My name is Keon Marshall. I am 42 years old, 6'2", broad-shouldered, with hands calloused from 20 years of construction work. The kind of man who can look at a cracked foundation and know exactly where the damage started before anyone else notices the wall is leaning. I thought I knew how to read things. I was wrong. I am going to tell you a story about my wife. Her name is Grace, and for 3 months I was certain I knew exactly who she was, until I discovered I had never truly seen her at all. For 3 months, 12 consecutive Fridays, somewhere between $250 and $300 had been quietly leaving our joint account. No label, no memo, just gone. Sometimes a cash withdrawal, sometimes a transfer to a number I didn't recognize. Always on a Friday. Always while I was still on the job site on Brookshire Freeway in Charlotte, North Carolina, covered in dust, thinking Grace was home making dinner. I didn't discover it the way a suspicious man might, snooping through her phone or checking receipts in her purse. I found it by accident, at 11:17 on a Thursday night, while trying to transfer funds for a lumber order. My work boots still on, my coffee going cold on the tailgate of my truck. I almost scrolled past it. Almost. I typed the phone number attached to the transfer into my browser. What came back was nothing useful. A prepaid line, no name, no address. Just a number staring back at me like a blank face. And then my mind, efficient, relentless, the way a frightened mind always is, began to fill in the empty space with its own answers. None of them were kind. Here is what you need to understand before this story goes any further. Those payments started exactly 1 week after the worst argument Grace and I had ever had. I had said things that night I couldn't take back. Things about her spending, her priorities, her apparent indifference to our future. I had been exhausted and afraid, and I had aimed that fear directly at her. And then, 7 days later, the quiet withdrawals began. Sitting in the cab of my truck in the parking lot of a Lowe's on South Tryon Street, I felt something cold settle into my chest. Not rage, not yet. Something quieter and more dangerous than rage. I felt like a man who had just discovered a crack in a wall he'd trusted his entire life. The house on Pembroke Knoll Drive was a good house. Brick-faced, with a covered porch and a Japanese maple Grace had planted the first autumn we moved in. There were no photographs of Grace's family anywhere. Not on the stairwell wall, not on the mantel. There never had been. I had asked once, in the early years, and she had simply said, "It's just me, Keon. It's been just me for a long time." I had loved her enough not to ask again. I thought that was respect. Sitting now in the dark kitchen, I wondered for the first time whether it had been love, or just the comfortable choice not to look too closely at a thing I was afraid to understand. I pulled into the driveway just past midnight. The lights were off except for the small lamp Grace always left on in the hallway, the one she called the welcome home light. I had teased her about it once. Said it made me feel like I was pulling into a bed and breakfast. She had laughed so hard she nearly spit sweet tea onto the kitchen floor. I sat in the truck for a while before going inside. Grace was asleep. I stood in the doorway of our bedroom and watched her breathe. Her natural curls spread against the white pillow, her face smooth and still. She always looked peaceful when she slept, like someone carrying no secrets at all. I went back downstairs. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where we had eaten 1,000 dinners, helped my nephew with homework, argued over whether the Ravens or the Panthers deserved anyone's loyalty. And I opened my laptop. I printed divorce papers. Clean and simple, pulled from a legal website. I knew about these forms because I'd sat with my brother Marcus through his divorce the year before. I set the papers on the table. I placed a pen beside them. Then I pressed my palms flat against the wood and breathed. I thought about the early years. A small apartment over on Beatty's Ford Road. The two of us eating takeout on a mattress on the floor because we couldn't afford furniture yet. Grace laughing at everything. The way she had held my face in both hands on our wedding day and said, "I see you, Keon. I really see you." I had believed that. I still wanted to believe it. That is the only reason I did not sign those papers that night. Instead, I made myself one promise. I would follow her the next Friday. I would see the truth with my own eyes instead of reading it off a screen. And if it was what I feared, I would come home, sit back down at this table, and pick up that pen. But I had to know first. A builder always checks the foundation before he tears anything down. I owed us both that much. What Keon saw the following Friday would shatter everything he thought he knew, but not in the way he expected. And what Grace had been doing on those 12 Fridays, and why she had never found the words to tell him, would be the thing that changed both of them forever. The following Friday, Keon left the job site at 4:30. He told his foreman Deshaun, a man who had worked alongside him for 9 years and still called him Youngblood, that he had a doctor's appointment. He hated lying to Deshaun, but some things you can't say out loud without them becoming real. "I'm going to follow my wife tonight" was one of them. He parked 2 blocks up from the house and waited. The Japanese maple had gone orange at the edges. October in Charlotte does that, sneaks the season in before you realize summer is gone. Keon sat with the engine off, a thermos of coffee balanced on his knee, watching the front door the way he used to watch job sites before a crew arrived. Patient. Still. At 6:12, Grace came out. She was wearing her good coat, the deep burgundy one she'd found at a consignment shop on North Davidson Street, and her natural hair was down around her shoulders instead of pulled up the way she usually wore it on weekdays. She was carrying an envelope. Keon set his thermos down and let her get half a block ahead before he started the engine. Grace drove south, out of their neighborhood, past the shopping centers on South Boulevard, past the old textile mill converted into condos, and then further, into a part of the city that didn't come up at dinner parties. A neighborhood where sidewalks had been patched so many times they looked like a quilt. Porch lights were the only lights because the street lamps had been out for months and nobody had fixed them. She parked in front of a small wooden house on Remount Road, paint peeling from the clapboard siding, a front fence that leaned like an old man whose knees had given up, a porch with a single bare bulb burning orange in the October dusk. Keon pulled over half a block back, cut the engine, waited. The front door opened before Grace even reached the porch steps. An elderly man stepped out, tall but bent slightly at the shoulders, the way tall men get in their later years. Close-cropped white hair, dark skin. The careful, deliberate movements of someone who had learned not to rush. Grace walked straight to him. No hesitation. She put her arms around him. Keon's jaw tightened. But something made him pause. Something in the posture of that embrace. It wasn't the grip of two people doing something wrong. It was slower, deeper. Grace pressed her face against the old man's shoulder. He patted her back, twice, gently, the way a grandfather pats a grandchild he loves beyond what words can carry. Keon had been in construction long enough to know the difference between a crack and a clean seam. This didn't look like a crack. But his fear wouldn't let him accept that yet. He got out of the truck and moved through the shadow of an overgrown magnolia at the edge of the yard, his boots quiet on the dying grass. He found a gap in the wooden siding near the base of the porch. A board warped away from its neighbor, leaving a space about the width of a man's palm. Keon crouched beside it. He could hear voices. He could see a sliver of warm lamplight. Grace's voice came first, soft, careful. The voice she used when she was trying not to cry. "Teacher, you've got to eat more than this. I can see you losing weight." The old man made a dismissive sound. "I eat fine. Stop fussing." "I'm not fussing. I'm worried." A pause, then the rustling of an envelope being opened. "My dear girl." The old man's voice was low and textured as old wood. "You don't need to bring me money every week. I've told you this." "And I told you," Grace said, her voice breaking at the edge, "that I'm going to keep doing it, for as long as I need to, for as long as you're here." Silence. "Grace." He said her name like something precious he was being careful with. "You've been doing this for years, long before you had the good life you have now, even when you had nothing." "You saved me when I had nothing," she said. "After the accident. I was 7 years old, Teacher Elias. 7 years old, and my parents were gone. And you are the reason I didn't disappear into the system and become invisible. So don't you tell me I don't need to come. Don't you dare tell me that." The old man said nothing. Keon pressed his back against the siding and looked up. The October sky was deep black between the branches of the magnolia overhead, cold and clear and completely indifferent to what he had just heard. He had followed his wife to collect evidence of something wrong. Instead, he had found something that made him feel like the worst kind of witness, the kind who arrives at a scene after the kindness has already happened, years too late to have been any part of it. Grace had been building something beautiful in secret, and he had spent 3 months building a case against her in his head. He pressed his forehead against the cold wood. Something broke open in his chest that he hadn't allowed to move in a very long time. Crouching in the October dark beside a gap in a rotting wooden wall, Keon wept. Quietly, completely, because 12 Fridays of suspicion had just collapsed into the simplest and most devastating truth. Grace had been quietly, faithfully loving the man who saved her life. And he had been ready to sign papers. What happened to Keon in that yard has a name. For 3 months, his mind had been running like a prosecutor building a case. Each unexplained withdrawal was a new piece of evidence. Each Friday that Grace left quietly was another. The mind, once it has decided something is true, becomes a remarkably efficient architect, selecting only what supports the structure it's already building and quietly discarding the rest. Psychologists call this confirmation bias, and it is one of the most dangerous forces inside a long-term relationship. Not because it makes us evil, but because it makes us absolutely certain we are right at the exact moment we are most dangerously wrong. Keon had not been a cruel husband. He had been a frightened man. And fear, when it goes unnamed, doesn't stay quiet. It finds a shape. For Keon, it shaped itself into suspicion, into surveillance, into divorce papers and a pen on a kitchen table. The painful reality? One honest question could have ended this 3 months earlier. "Grace, what's this payment for?" That's all it would have taken. Keon spent 3 months building an entire case inside his head and never once asked her a single question. Be honest right now. If you found secret payments in your spouse's account today, would your first move be to ask or to assume you already knew the answer? Drop a 1 if you'd ask first. Drop a 2 if deep down you'd already be certain you knew the truth. Stay with me, because what Keon did next and what he found when he walked through that door is something none of us see coming. A man who has just realized he was wrong doesn't always know what to do with his hands. Keon stood in the side yard for a full 2 minutes, just breathing. The magnolia tree behind him dropped a dry leaf. Somewhere down Remount Road, a dog barked twice and went quiet. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. Then he walked to the front of the house and knocked. He heard Grace's voice cut off mid-sentence. Floorboards creaked. Then the silence of two people looking at each other, asking with their eyes, "Who could that be?" The door opened. Grace stood in the doorway in her burgundy coat, the empty envelope still in her hand. When she saw Keon's face, the red-rimmed eyes, the jaw working to hold itself together, the color left her entirely. Then something shifted in her expression. Not guilt, but the particular stillness of a person deciding whether to open a door or hold it closed. "Keon," barely above a whisper. "You followed me." Not a question. "I did," he said. "I'm not going to excuse that. But Grace, I need you to let me say something first. Please." A long moment. Her hand rested on the door frame. She looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she has loved for years and is not yet sure she still recognizes. Then she stepped aside. Behind her, Teacher Elias stood in the narrow hallway, leaning slightly against the wall, watching with the steady, unhurried eyes of a man who has seen enough of life to recognize when a moment truly matters. Keon looked at the old man for a long moment. Then, "You're the man who saved my wife when she was 7 years old." Teacher Elias held his gaze and nodded once. "I did what any decent person would have done." "No, sir," Keon said quietly. "Most decent people walk past." "You didn't." He stepped through the doorway. The inside of the house was small and worn, but clean. A plaid armchair by the window, a side table stacked with library books and a ceramic mug. And on the walls, framed photographs. Rows of school children, youth basketball teams. A man in his 40s standing with 24 kids in front of a school bus. Everyone squinting into summer sun. An entire life of quiet service, recorded in fading frames on a thin wall. Keon understood more in 30 seconds than he had in 3 months of suspicion. He turned to Grace. "I know," he said. "I heard. I was outside." He watched shame cross her face and held up one hand. "Don't, please. I need to say something first. I found the payments 3 months ago. I didn't ask you about them. I sat alone with my suspicions, and I fed them instead of coming to you. I pulled up divorce papers, Grace, had them printed, had a pen sitting right beside them on our kitchen table last night." Grace's hand went to her mouth. "I was going to sign them, if tonight turned out to be what I feared." He exhaled slowly. "I'm telling you this because you deserve to know how close I came to destroying the best thing in my life without ever asking you one honest question." Grace began to cry, not delicately, but in the full, ragged way that comes when something long held finally breaks into open air. Her shoulders shook. Keon crossed the room and put his arms around her. Teacher Elias, without a word, eased himself into his plaid armchair and gave them the only thing the small room had to give, the grace of looking quietly at the floor. Notice what Keon does here, and what he deliberately does not do. He doesn't explain away his suspicion as reasonable. He doesn't soften the confession with, "But you have to understand my perspective." He states the truth plainly, the ugly, uncomfortable, full truth, and offers it not as an excuse, but as a reckoning. Relationship researchers have found consistently that the couples who endure are not the ones who never hurt each other. They are the ones who can say, "I was wrong. Here is exactly how I was wrong. I'm sorry." without conditions, without the but. This is called radical accountability. And it is rare, because the ego fights it with everything it has. The ego whispers, if you admit this completely, you lose. But in a marriage, that logic is exactly backward. When one person finds the courage to be fully accountable, both people win. The wall finally comes down. They sat together for a long time, the three of them, drinking tea that Teacher Elias insisted on making himself. He came back with 3 mismatched mugs on a tray, advertising a hardware store that had probably been closed since the mid-90s. He told Keon things about Grace she had never told Keon herself. How she had come to him at 7 years old, 2 weeks after the car accident that took her parents. How she had sat in the back of his after-school program on Beatty's Ford Road every day for 2 weeks without speaking to a single person. How Teacher Elias had eventually pulled a chair beside her and simply sat in silence, until she decided on her own that silence was something you could share rather than endure alone. How she had graduated, built a life, and 7 years ago found him again, living alone in this house, his heart being monitored like a slow, ticking clock, and had simply begun to show up every Friday. I told her she didn't owe me anything, Teacher Elias said, wrapping both hands around his mug. She told me owing had nothing to do with it. Keon looked at Grace. Grace looked at her tea. Why didn't you tell me? He asked. No accusation, just genuine bewilderment. Grace was quiet for a moment. You knew about Teacher Elias. I told you about him, years ago. The man who kept me out of the system after my parents died. You nodded. You said, I'm glad someone was there for you. And then we moved on to something else. She set the empty envelope on the side table. I don't think you forgot. I think you just didn't know how much it still mattered. And I never made you understand, because I was afraid of what would happen if I did. After what you said that night, about my spending, about my priorities, I thought, if I tell him I've been giving money to this man every week, he'll see it as something I'm choosing over us. And I couldn't let him look at the most sacred thing I've ever done and call it reckless. She paused. So I stopped telling you, and the silence became its own kind of wall. This is the second wound, quieter than Keon's suspicion, but just as deep. Grace had been keeping a secret, not because she was dishonest, but because she had learned from one unguarded moment in an argument that there were parts of herself that felt unsafe to share with the man she loved. Psychologists call this emotional withholding born from anticipated judgment. When we believe someone will criticize what we care most about, we stop sharing it. We carry it alone. And the cruel irony is that protecting it creates more distance, which creates more misunderstanding, which creates more silence. One harsh sentence in one argument had quietly closed a door between them, and Grace, not knowing how to open it again, had simply learned to live with a door that no longer opened. Then Teacher Elias said something quietly, almost to himself, that made Keon go very still. She mentioned once, the old man said, not looking up from his mug, that she had thought about what she would do if the marriage became too hard, if she felt too alone in it. She had started thinking about a separate plan. He paused. I told her not to decide anything in a hurry. Most walls have a door in them somewhere. You just have to find it. Keon turned slowly to look at Grace. Grace didn't meet his eyes. And Keon Marshall, a man who built things for a living, who prided himself on reading structures clearly, understood with cold, absolute certainty that the damage had not been done to him. The damage had been done by him. To her. To them. One careless word, at a time. The following Saturday morning, Keon arrived at Remount Road at 8 o'clock with his pickup, his full toolkit, and 2 crew members who owed him a favor. He stood on the front walk and looked at the house the way he always studied a structure. Not at what it was, but at what it had been before neglect set in. The bones were good. The foundation was solid. It just needed someone to pay attention again. Teacher Elias appeared in the doorway, looking at the assembled equipment with an expression carefully balanced between moved and annoyed. "I didn't ask for any of this," he said. "No, sir, you didn't," Keon agreed pleasantly, already unloading the ladder. "That's generally when people need it most." Teacher Elias made a sound that might have been a laugh, quickly suppressed, and went back inside to put the coffee on. There is something quietly profound in this moment that is easy to miss. Keon is doing what builders do, showing up with tools and getting to work. But this is not simply a man fixing a roof. This is a man in the early stages of what psychologists call reparative behavior, making amends not with words alone, but with sustained, visible action. Words after a breach of trust can feel hollow. What slowly rebuilds trust is repeated, consistent action over time. Not one grand gesture, not an apology and a grocery run, but showing up, again and again, until something in the other person's chest finally begins to believe, he means it this time. The work took shape one honest problem at a time. 3 roof sections needed immediate attention. Grace arrived at 10 with 2 bags of groceries and a color-coded pill organizer she had put together for Teacher Elias. Medications sorted by day and time, a laminated instruction card taped inside the kitchen cabinet. Teacher Elias regarded the pill organizer as though it had personally offended him. "I've been managing my own medication for 70 years. And you've been doing a truly remarkable job," Grace said, kissing his cheek, "which is why I'd like it to continue." He grumbled. He used the pill organizer. Keon watched from the roof and smiled. A real smile. The first one in a long time. Over the weeks that followed, Keon and Grace talked more than they had in months combined. Not dramatic conversations, just real ones. The kind that start as logistics and gradually become something else entirely. Keon told her about the lumber order, the banking app, the 2 days he had spent not asking questions he should have asked. Grace told him something he wasn't prepared for. In the 3 weeks after their argument, she had driven past Teacher Elias's house 4 times without stopping. She had sat parked outside, wondering whether Keon was right, whether everything she cared about beyond their marriage was somehow a problem, whether she was asking for too much by simply being who she was. Keon stopped his work when she said that. "I made you feel like that," he said. It was not a question. "I let my own fear make me feel like that," Grace said carefully. "But yes, what you said gave my fear somewhere to live." What Grace said is worth pausing on. She did not say, "You made me feel that way." She said, "What you said gave my fear somewhere to live." That distinction matters. This is a woman who understands her own role in what unfolded. She holds Keon accountable, but she also holds herself accountable for choosing silence over honesty, for assuming he would judge her rather than giving him the chance to understand. Relationship psychologists call this co-created patterns, the idea that most relationship problems are not simply done by one person to another, but built together, slowly, through the choices both people make. Keon's harsh words created fear in Grace. Grace's silence created distance in Keon. Keon's distance deepened his suspicion. Grace's secrecy seemed to confirm it. Neither set out to harm the other, but together, through fear, pride, and the failure to simply speak, they had walked themselves to the edge. This matters because if both people helped create the problem, both people hold the power to end it. It was on the 3rd weekend that Keon went into the attic. He was checking the roof decking for water damage from the inside when his flashlight swept across a cardboard box pushed into the far corner under the eave. The box had come apart at one corner, and a composition notebook had slid halfway out. He recognized the handwriting on the cover immediately. The particular curve Grace put on her capital G. He told himself later he should have stopped, should have taken it down and handed it to her and let her decide. He genuinely believed that. But he opened it. Most of the notebook was old, high school-era handwriting, smaller and more hurried than the Grace he knew now. Lists, schedules, private notes about pushing through when things were difficult. The quiet record of a young woman building a life with nothing but determination and faith. He turned the pages slowly, careful with them. Near the back, the handwriting shifting, becoming the Grace of today, he found a page that stopped his breath cold. If he doesn't change, I won't be able to keep living like this. That sentence, just that. Below it, as though she had continued thinking through the pen, I love him, but I have been so lonely inside this marriage that sometimes I feel like I'm shouting in an empty room. He's right there, 3 feet away at dinner, 8 inches away in bed, and I am alone. I don't know how to make him understand what he can't see. Keon sat down on the attic floor. Sitting there with his wife's handwriting in his hands and the roof he had just repaired above his head, Keon Marshall wept. What Keon is experiencing right now has a name. Psychologists call it the second wound, the moment when a person who believed they were the wronged party discovers they were also, in a different and quieter way, the one doing the wounding. The first wound felt clean, secret payments, possible betrayal. He was the victim. The story was simple. The second wound is far more painful because it requires him to look at himself without flinching. He had believed he was a good husband because he was faithful, present, and providing. He had confused the absence of cruelty with the presence of love. There is a quiet pattern in many long marriages. A husband or a wife who never leaves, never cheats, never raises their voice above a certain measured level, and genuinely believes this is enough. But being in the same room is not the same as being with someone. Paying the bills is not the same as making someone feel seen. Staying is not the same as making a person feel that staying is worth it. Grace had been profoundly alone inside a marriage to a man who was faithfully, physically present. That is a particular kind of loneliness, the kind that is hardest to name, because from the outside, everything looks fine. Until a notebook in an attic tells the truth that the dinner table never could. He pressed the notebook gently closed, held it with both hands, the way you hold something you understand finally is breakable. Then he climbed back down the attic stairs, walked into the kitchen where Teacher Elias was telling Grace about a former student who had gone on to serve the community in ways the old man could still barely believe. And he set the notebook quietly on the table between them. Grace looked at it. Then she looked at him. I found it, he said simply. I'm sorry I wasn't the man you felt safe enough to tell. Grace reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Some things land harder in silence than any words could carry them. There is a kind of repair work that doesn't come with instructions. Keon had spent 20 years in construction. He knew how to read a blueprint, how to sequence a job, how to look at a failing structure and work backward from the damage to the cause. He knew you don't patch over a cracked foundation. You expose it, understand it, fix it properly, and then you build from there. Everything else is just delay dressed up as progress. So that is what he did. With Teacher Elias's house, and with his marriage, because it turned out the two had become, unexpectedly, irreversibly, the same job. Every Saturday from that November into the early weeks of winter, Keon arrived at the house on Remount Road with tools and materials and the patient, methodical energy of a man who had stopped rushing toward conclusions. He replaced the roof decking where water had gotten in and been quietly ignored too long. He repainted the exterior, a warm cream color that Grace chose and Teacher Elias called a little fancy, which everyone understood to mean he loved it completely. He fixed the front fence post by post, leveling each one the way you're supposed to, not the way you do it when you're in a hurry and hoping nobody notices. He rewired the 2 back rooms running off a circuit that made Keon genuinely nervous. He replumbed the bathroom. And then, near the end of November, he built a rocking chair. That was not in any blueprint. He had simply measured the porch one afternoon while Teacher Elias rested and decided that a man who had spent 60-plus years giving his time to other people's children deserved somewhere comfortable to sit and watch the evening arrive. He built it from white oak, with wide armrests and a back angled to ease rather than fight an old man's spine. It took 2 full weekends and more careful sanding than he'd done since his apprenticeship years. When he carried it onto the porch, Teacher Elias looked at it without speaking for a moment. Then he sat down in it. The chair rocked smooth and easy, not a creak in it. Teacher Elias gripped the armrests, cleared his throat. "Good work," he said. From Teacher Elias, this was approximately the equivalent of a standing ovation. What Keon is building here, the roof, the fence, the wiring, the chair, is not simply a renovation project. Each act of repair carries its own quiet psychological weight. Therapists who work with couples often note that after a major breach of trust, one of the most powerful things a person can do is make things better in the physical world around the person they love. Not as a transaction, not, "I fixed the house, so now we're even," but as a daily embodied declaration. I am paying attention. I see what has been neglected. I am choosing to show up. Trust is not rebuilt in a single conversation, no matter how honest. It is rebuilt in the accumulation of small, consistent acts over time, each one saying, without words, "I mean what I said." The rocking chair is not just furniture. It is a promise in white oak. While Keon worked on the house, Grace worked on something harder, telling the truth about what the previous years had actually cost her. Not all at once, not dramatically, but in pieces, the way you unpack a box you've been avoiding, one item at a time, making sure there's a place for each thing before you reach for the next. She told Keon that in the first year of their marriage, she had felt, for the first time in her adult life, genuinely safe. That the slow, quiet erosion of that feeling had terrified her. Not because the marriage was visibly failing, but precisely because it wasn't. Because how do you grieve a marriage that looks fine from the outside and still leaves you feeling unseen on the inside? There is no language for that grief. There is no obvious moment to point to. It just accumulates, the way dust accumulates in a room nobody quite gets around to cleaning. She told him she had thought more than once about what a separate life might look like. Not because she wanted one, because she was trying to prepare herself, the way she had always prepared herself for hard things, quietly, privately, without asking anyone for help. Keon listened. He did not defend himself, and he did not minimize what she was saying. He just listened, which, as Grace told him later, was the thing she had needed from him for far longer than either of them had realized. He told her what he had never fully admitted to himself, that after his father left when Keon was 11, he had made a private, bone-level resolution to never be the man who walked out. He would be faithful. He would stay. He would provide. And somewhere along the way, he had confused staying with showing up, confused providing with loving, and confused never leaving with never making someone feel alone. He had been so determined not to be his father that he had never stopped to ask what Grace actually needed him to be. "I was afraid," he said, "of losing you, and that fear turned inward, into watching instead of trusting, into suspicion instead of the one conversation I should have had months ago." Grace was quiet for a moment. "I was afraid too, of being a burden, of asking for more than I thought I deserved, of showing you the parts of my life that felt like weakness." It was Teacher Elias, as was becoming his habit, who said it plainest. One evening over his kitchen table, both hands around his coffee mug, he looked at the two of them with the patient directness of a man who has watched too many people make the same avoidable mistakes over too many decades. "You were both afraid," he said, "and neither of you told the other person what you were afraid of. So you built your separate walls and stood on opposite sides of them and wondered why the house felt so cold." He let that sit. "Don't do that anymore." He said it the same way he had probably told students not to make the same math error for the third time. Direct, patient, not unkind. The kind of instruction that expects to be followed. Keon laughed first, then Grace. A real laugh, the full room kind, that none of them had managed since this whole ordeal began. Teacher Elias allowed himself a small, quiet smile, directed at his coffee mug so nobody would make too much of it. The house on Remount Road began to look like itself again. New roof, straight fence, freshly painted walls catching the thin winter light and returning it warmer than it came. And two people working side by side in the sawdust and the cold, choosing, deliberately, imperfectly, daily, to say the things they had been afraid to say. Somewhere in the middle of all that honest work, Keon and Grace began to look like themselves again, too. By the time spring came to Charlotte, Teacher Elias's porch would hold something none of them had planned for, and it would be the most beautiful thing Keon had ever built. Spring came to Charlotte the way spring usually does. Tentatively at first, then all at once, as though the city had simply decided it was done being cold. The dogwoods on the side streets went from bare branches to white blossoms over what seemed like a single weekend. On Remount Road, Teacher Elias's house stood straight and clean in the new warmth. Cream-painted walls bright in the April light, front fence perfectly level, new roof holding rain the way a good roof is supposed to hold it. Quietly, without drama, without anyone needing to worry about it at all. The rocking chair on the porch moved gently in the morning breeze. Teacher Elias sat in it every evening now, watching the neighborhood come and go. He had two neighbors who had started stopping by. A woman from down the block he'd nodded to for years, without ever quite finding a reason to speak, and a retired city bus driver named Harold, who had lived across the street for 15 years without an introduction. Turns out, a man sitting peacefully on a porch is an invitation. People see it and think, that looks like somewhere I could rest for a minute. His health had stabilized, not cured, because the heart doesn't simply forgive 70 years of use, but managed carefully, watched closely, given better odds. The doctors at Carolina's Medical Center had noted, with cautious satisfaction, that he seemed stronger than at his last visit. Teacher Elias, when informed, had said simply, "I have people who show up." He said it the way you state a structural fact, not with sentiment, with certainty. This is why the building holds. One Saturday in late April, Grace arrived with a cast-iron Dutch oven full of her mother's chicken and rice, a recipe reconstructed from memory and a stained index card she'd found in a box of her parents' belongings years ago. There was a coffee ring stain on the corner she had always meant to transfer to a clean card, but somehow she never had, because the stain felt like proof the recipe had been used and loved. Some things are more true for being worn. Teacher Elias ate 2 full bowls and was on his way back for a third when Grace caught him and he pretended he'd just been walking to the window to check the weather. Keon, from the porch where he was applying a weather finish to the new railing, said nothing. He had learned some things were better appreciated in silence. There was, in that small house that afternoon, a quality of lightness that none of the three of them commented on directly. You don't remark on good weather while it's happening, for fear of jinxing it. You just let it exist. The food and the table, and the warm light through the kitchen window, and the sound of Grace gesturing at Teacher Elias with a wooden spoon, while he maintained, without any real conviction, that there was a right way and a wrong way to season a cast-iron skillet, and he had always known it. Keon came in when the railing was done, washed his hands at the kitchen sink, and stood for a moment watching Grace set bowls on the table, her hair coming loose from its bun the way it always did by midday, her voice animated and warm and entirely, fully herself. He thought about the night he had sat at the kitchen table on Pembroke Knoll Drive with a pen beside divorce papers. He thought about how close it had come. He made himself sit with that, not to punish himself, because Grace had told him that guilt held past its usefulness becomes just another wall, but to remember it, to let the memory of how close he had come to throwing everything away be the thing that kept him choosing differently every day going forward. What Keon and Grace have traveled through together, suspicion, silence, painful revelation, reparative action, and honest conversation, is what relationship psychologists call a crisis and repair cycle. And research consistently shows that couples who successfully navigate one of these cycles often emerge with a stronger, more honest bond than they had before the crisis. Not because the pain was good, but because the pain forced them to have the conversations they should have been having all along. Keon had to lose almost everything before he found out what he had. Grace had to be found in the most vulnerable, private act of her adult life before she could stop carrying it alone. Teacher Elias had to let strangers into his house before he remembered what it felt like to have people. All three of them had been, in their own way, protecting themselves from the very thing they needed most. And all three of them had to stop protecting long enough to let someone in. That is the lesson. Not that love conquers all, because love on its own is not enough. What saves a marriage is not just love. It is the daily, humble, sometimes frightening choice to tell the truth, even when you're afraid of what the truth will cost you. After dinner, while Teacher Elias rested in the plaid armchair, the kind of rest that looked peaceful rather than exhausted, which was itself a kind of miracle, Keon and Grace walked the small path that ran behind the houses along Remount Road. A stretch of chain-link fence and volunteer honeysuckle just beginning to bloom, scenting the warm April air in that particular way honeysuckle does, sweet and insistent and entirely southern. Grace slipped her hand into his. "I almost lost myself," she said quietly, "because I was afraid you wouldn't understand me." Keon tightened his hand around hers. "And I almost let go of the most wonderful woman in my life, just because I refused to ask one honest question." They walked without speaking for a little while after that, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. They stopped at the end of the path, stood together as the late April light went gold over the rooftops. Teacher Elias's white roof among them, straight and solid. And Keon thought about foundations, about how the work of keeping something standing is never truly finished, about how the difference between a structure that holds and one that fails is rarely the dramatic thing, the earthquake, the flood. It's usually something small, quiet, and neglected. A question never asked. A fear never named. One honest conversation that kept getting pushed to tomorrow. One conversation, 5 months late. On a small porch on Remount Road, in a rocking chair that didn't creak, that was all it took to begin again. The secret payments were never the problem. The silence was. On both sides. Fear had made them strangers to each other inside the same house, at the same table, in the same bed. And the fix, as any good builder will tell you, was the same fix that always works. Go back to the foundation, find the crack, tell the truth about what you see, and build from there. What looks like betrayal can sometimes be the other person's quiet way of carrying something they were afraid you wouldn't understand. What looks like distance can sometimes be a person who loves you, holding a door open just a crack, waiting to see if you'll come and knock. If you are sitting across from someone tonight and feeling strangely far away from them, Put down what you're holding, turn toward them, and ask the question you've been afraid to ask. The one that starts with, "Is there something you've been carrying that you haven't felt safe enough to tell me?" The answer might surprise you. It might save a whole life. Thank you for spending this time with Keon, Grace, and Teacher Elias. May you carry a little of their honesty home with you today. These powerful stories were written by real people with deep emotions and life experience. With AI serving only as a